The Apagon at 845 yards sank in deeper water with most of her compartments flooded. Her conning tower hatch and several bulkheads had failed and a tank top was ruptured. Divers found a hole through the pressure hull forward. A fourth submarine, the Dentuda, submerged at 1,500 yards, had settled to the bottom from flooding that a crew could have controlled. Raised, she had to be beached. Damage to other submarines was not significant, although raising them called for solid seamanship by divers, salvage workers, and deckhands. Exteriors of all the submarines raised required decontamination. Submarine hulls proved their ability to absorb much damage. Nevertheless, submarine batteries, although shock-mounted, proved seriously vulnerable. The concrete barge YO-160 sank immediately. Another small craft, the LCT-1114, was capsized by the burst. Her bottom showed no evidence of damage. Demolition charges were used to sink her. 5 ships were immobilized by the blast. The Fallon, nearest of the APAs to the explosion at 500 yards, had her shell and bottom wrinkled, her decks buckled, her hatches dished in, her boiler foundations stressed, and her air casings ruptured. On the Fallon, as on several other ships, radioactive coral sand from the lagoon bottom and fragments apparently from the LSM-60 were found. Beached with the Fallon was the destroyer Hughes, which had flooded through fractured sea connections and piping. At 635 yards, all her boilers were badly damaged. Her main engines were inoperable. Wave action had damaged topside hamper, and 2 torpedoes hung precariously from her deck tubes. The Gasconade, 580 yards, flooded her engine spaces through broken saltwater lines, but she remained afloat. Her shell was wrinkled, her hatches were dished in, and much electrical equipment was damaged. The cruiser Pensacola, crippled by the air burst, was the largest ship immobilized by the underwater burst. She was 640 yards from 0 point. Her boilers were badly damaged. 3 of her main battery mounts were inoperable. Propelling and auxiliary machinery was seriously damaged. Hull damage added to the destruction. Shell plating was dished in, and bulkheads and stanchions were deranged. She was kept floating only by difficult salvage operations. The LST-133 was rendered immobile by damage to her main deck, hull, and ballast tanks. Flooding made her machinery inoperative. 5 ships suffered serious loss of military efficiency. 3 of these were battleships. The New York, at 820 yards, suffered minor flooding from opened seams in shell plating and tanks. 3 turrets were inoperable from fractured holding down clips. 2 boilers were temporarily useless, and her fire pumping system and a diesel generator were rendered inoperable. The Nevada, at 1,030 yards, suffered damage to her main steering unit and diesel generator. The holding down clips on one main turret were sheared off, making the turret inoperable. Much dished-in plating was observed. The Pennsylvania, at 1,200 yards, suffered minor structural failure and leaked through stern tubes and shaft glands. The Salt Lake City, at 1,200 yards, leaked after the heavy hull shock through stern tubes, shaft glands, rudder bearings, and some piping. The destroyer Mayrant, at 815 yards, received damage to bulkheads, stanchions, and weather hatches, plus flooding from broken lines and some boiler damage. In general, surface vessels within 800 yards were either sunk, rendered immobile, or seriously impaired in military efficiency. Slight loss of military efficiency was felt by vessels as far out as 1,300 yards from blast center. The range of major hull damage for typical service combat vessels was approximately 625 yards. The range of minor hull damage was approximately 950 yards. 8 of the 18 target craft on the beach were swamped or partially flooded. 1 LCVP was washed off the beach and sank. Baker Day, however, produced information more overwhelming than the vast extent of ship damage. For the first time, the insidious potentialities of radioactive contamination were fully revealed. These death-dealing potentialities had been predicted. Now they were actual. Months later, lingering radioactive contamination was an invisible menace to any form of life at Bikini. For days, and in some cases months after the tests, monitors carried out extensive patrols of Bikini Lagoon, the target ships, aircraft, the islands, the air, and the open sea adjacent to the lagoon. Shortage of monitors handicapped the work, but by dint of great effort it was accomplished. Data from thousands of radiation recording devices had to be tabulated in these studies. For the first time, detailed studies of radioactive contamination could be made. In previous atomic explosions, most of the radioactive poisons had been carried off in the mushroom clouds. Now, about 50% of these fission products remained in the water where they had been discharged by the blast. Decontamination was a grave problem. Methods had to be improvised to reduce the overall contamination sufficiently to allow collection of instruments and technical examinations. The poisons restricted the movement of men and ships. They made target vessels uninhabitable for long periods. They revealed how a harbor or an entire city could be crippled with silent, unseen death. In Test Able, gamma radiation was dominant. In Test Baker, alpha and beta particles were an added danger. Months after the explosion, target vessels were death traps for human life because of these radiations. Continuous monitoring was necessary to protect workers from undue exposure. Fatalities could occur from ingestion or inhaling of microscopic quantities of plutonium or long-lived fission products. The deadliness to humans is aggravated by their tendency to accumulate in the bones. Radiologists knew that alpha radioactivity from plutonium diminishes very little over periods of years. How to cope with this plutonium poisoning is still one of the chief problems of health physics and of industrial hygiene. Decontamination of dangerous areas requires new knowledge and new techniques employed by large groups of skillfully trained radiological personnel. Gamma radiation in Test Baker differed from similar radiation in Test Able. In Test Able, the period of intense gamma radiation was limited to seconds. In Test Baker, intense gamma radiation remained in some areas for weeks and in others for months. Radioactivity in the water was created by fission products which emitted beta and gamma radiation and by unfissioned plutonium from the bomb which emitted alpha particles. The alpha particles themselves are of low penetrating power, but micrograms of alpha-emitting material within the human body are fatal. Gamma rays readily penetrate flesh, water, and clothing, but are reduced to half intensity by about 1 inch of steel. The cloud and base surge caused a radioactive precipitation 1,800 yards upwind from 0 point and 2 to 5 miles downwind.